The title of Adrian Rifkin's talk is concerning the space between the gaze and the screen, sex chat rooms and the future of an illusion. Adrian is Professor of Visual Culture and Media at Middlesex University, having gone from Leeds. He is the author of Street Noises, Parisian Pleasures, 1900 to 1940. And this year, what's come out is the text, Ingres, Then and Now. He's researched and written very widely on culturally and art historically on topics ranging from popular music and opera to canteen aesthetics and gay subjectivities. He's currently editor of the journal Art History. I'd like to welcome Adrian Rifkin.
There's getting a bit of switching to and from the computer, but not much, because I'm going to cut down the number of pictures you're going to get radically. They'll happen at the point where I need it. I want to preface what I'm going to say today by saying that just make a number of comments. One of which I think that, seeing we are in an essentially Freudian conference, that the concept of Nachträglichkeit is well and truly the alibi of the cowardly academic, and that each stage of preparing the materials which I've been preparing today has been one of realizing that there is never any possibility of recuperating the intention with which I set out, and that therefore, in a sense, each stage of the process of trying to present the material may as well be provisional and lost. In fact, the material was originally thought out for the idea that Neil Leach had that began the whole process leading to this conference, which was that of housing the unconscious. And I was searching around at the time that Neil asked me to contribute to this conference, called Housing the Unconscious, for some way of rationalizing this very banal addiction which academics, like all other people, get to current forms of consumerism and popular consumption. I wanted to find some way of harnessing the energies which I'd already poured into sex chat rooms from the moment I first discovered one on my computer, and harnessing the energies poured into these into some productive output, just as at previous stages of my work I'd harnessed the energies wasted, if you want to put it like that, on reading detective stories or listening to French 30s music or whatever, that there had to be some product. This moralistic urge drove my acceptance of Neil's contribution to write about housing the unconscious, and up to the point where it became Psychoanalysis and Space, the thinking was driven by this notion of housing the unconscious and by the absurdity of having a very obvious and simple and ridiculously reduced analogy, that of the computer housing as a housing for the unconscious, which itself, of course, needs no housing since it has neither time nor place. And indeed, if, in Lacan's famous phrase, the unconscious is structured like a language, the concept of a housing for it anyway falls into uselessness, which perhaps is why Neil dropped the title, leaving me, so to speak, with the concept, and we have the current thing. So there is a kind of lapse between what I have to say and what I wanted to say, which is now just one stage in a longer process. I want to begin with a quotation from Robert Browning. It's a phrase from his poem, his famous poem, My Last Duchess, which I'll just briefly set the scene up for those of you who don't know the poem, which is a duke, a famous Renaissance Italian duke is imagined, who could be a Gonzaga, he could be a Medici, showing his visitors, showing ambassadors around his art collection. And he points with great pride to one particular painting, which he calls, Ah, That's My Last Duchess. And we become quickly aware, in a very rapid, very swiftly moving set of short lines, that this Duchess is there to be memorized because the Duke has had her poisoned. Had her poisoned because she flirts too much. And now he simply waits for his next Duchess, or perhaps no more Duchess at all. But as he talks to the ambassadors, he utters these lines. This is the Duke to the ambassadors. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked, and her looks went everywhere. And I found, in a sense, that this metaphor provided by my last Duchess with my own relation with the screen, with the chat room, was one that led me to think of the very particular and peculiar relations of sexualities and their representability to themselves in a period which is based on consumerism of one kind or another, and on the very free availability of self-representations or possible representations, with the irony that the equivalent of the last Duchess has now become the next Duchess. And if I were to take you through all 259 JPEGs that I have on the hard disk on this computer here, which I've either collected from the internet or which have been sent to me by my interlocutors on chat rooms, you would begin to see what I mean about my next Duchess. The problem is that it's precisely the last Duchess who can no longer be staged in the way in which the Duke was able to stage her, for the last Duchess never well and truly existed. The last Duchess, if you like, is the essence of Nachträglichkeit. The object of this paper, then, is to bring together discussion of a number of particular and typical problems of modernity, but to do this in the space between the eye and the computer screen, and to see about how the relations between these problems of modernity play out across this space. As I say, this was originally geared to the title of the conference, Our Housing the Unconscious. And that, as I've already suggested, is something which was useful and perhaps wasn't useful. What follows then is not, in the first instance, indebted to the apposition of psychoanalysis and space proposed for this weekend, or both these terms enter into my discussion. In fact, it might be more interesting to think about place rather than space, but only place in its particularity as this place or that place, something which itself, as we saw in Lacan's Viennese era, in Tony's talk yesterday, is also place, quite possibly indeterminable or significant only in the impossibility of determining it. For as we saw in Lacan's instance, is precisely his error which turned out to be productive in the next week of the seminar. The problems of modernity which I wanted to think about, or which have been driving my thinking, are those of consumerism, mass communication, and technological transformation, taken together within a critical framework strung out between, for example, Theodore Adorno, Guy Debord, and Julia Kristeva, particularly in her last 10 years of writing. That is to say, that I'm concerned with what these theorists see as the modern subject being trapped within a system of coordinates that induce a state of instantaneous and unproblematic well-being, so that the subject can perceive neither an outside to their being, a politics of transformation, for example, they can see no outside to the being or to their pleasure, such as a politics of transformation, nor indeed any inside to their being, or suspect any inside to their being, the feeling of what Kristeva continues to call the process of néantisation, bringing together concepts of the Freudian unconscious with the Sartrean concept of the néant. And precisely for Kristeva, it's this concept of your own unbeing which produces the possibility of reflexivity or revolt, as she talks about in her most recent writing. The increasing use of the personal computer and the internet, I think, must be understood as currently paradigmatic of such problems. And I want to talk about them as paradigmatic without any prejudice, without any panic, or without being a Luddite. On the contrary, I think it's important, if we're to work in a spirit of Freudo-Lacanian investigation, that we choose precisely to think about those points of daily activity which are the most banal and which the most resemble those processes of daily chatter at which the lapsus can take place, at which we can make one kind of mistake or another in which we can mistake one kind of thing for another. Again, I think this is a sufficiently well-established procedure in cultural practice these days, in cultural criticism, from, say, an axis going from Barthes or Judith Williamson to Slavoj Zizek, for us to accept that this is a proper procedure. And that the more, in a sense, if we like, we can take an activity which is drained of any intended search for profound significance, the more accurate we might, at the heart of a consumer culture, at the heart of the denéantisation of the human subject, to be able to assign precisely new figures for the unconscious, or we might not, in which case we might have to sink into the line of pessimism which extends from Adorno to Kristeva, and for which Kristeva finds some kind of a solution in her analytic practice and in the bringing of her analytic practice to a rethinking of writers, as she's currently rethinking, like Hannah Arendt, Melanie Klein, and Colette. In doing this, I'm working out from a very set of minimal phrases from a thinker such as Lacan or thinkers such as Freud, or from Lacan and Freud. Let's not say such as, let's say from Lacan and Freud. I'm not, again, concerned with trying to have a théorie d'ensemble drawn from Lacan, a psychoanalytic theory, but with the ways in which certain phrases from certain of Lacan's seminars might help one to think through the processes which are taking place in a particular form of banal modern utterances. And I want, in a sense, to take as the paradigm or the origin for such a banal utterance a short discussion of Lacan's in the 5th seminar, in the Formation de l'inconscient, where he talks about the relationship between the infant and the mother, and the intervention into that relationship of two vocables, deux vocables, as providing all the materials which are necessary for the formation of the unconscious. Now, again, to say this is to plead for a certain kind of analogical thinking, for a space between myself and the computer screen, which can be matched to a space suggested by Lacan as the space in which the unconscious arises. But it's an analogy, again, in the sense of looking at perhaps quite a banal or quite an evident relationship where, think about what Andrew has just said, that Lacan can be used in a sense to diagrammatize that relationship between myself and the screen in such a way as to problematize a wider set of relationships of the modern subject to its materials of self-representation at this particular historical conjuncture. I think, for example, of the language of the chat room. And I'm going to work for the time, so I don't have to go into exposition here. I'm going to work on the assumption, the very short time I have, that you all know roughly how chat rooms work. That you go into gay slave market or gay bondage or whatever you want, interested in going, and that you check through the various names on the screen, which are aliases. I've gone to great length in all the talks I've given around this to protect the aliases. One ends up protecting the inauthentic in order to sustain the desire for inauthenticity, which is authentically invested in it. You come up with someone, as I came up with very early in my searches, round about a year ago, of glove slave. Glove slave, of course, the name appealed to me. I was interested by the name glove slave, so I pressed on the button profile and read glove slave's short and simple profile. It wasn't like some of the profiles you get which tell you everything about their mother and their father and their dog and their car and their hobbies and this and that and the other. And it wasn't one of those very rude profiles which says, if you want to know what computer I've got, you're not for me. It was a very simple, very straightforward profile which gave a height, a haircut, more or less a body form, and then said, I am an admirer of tight black leather gloves and men who wear them. I thought I'd hit gold. This seemed to me, in a sense, to be ideal. I am a man. I did have tight black leather gloves, and I could put them on and have glove slave invest in me. But then, of course, and this is where This is where, in a sense, one is never free. This is where, in a sense, one cannot be free. And one's formation, if you like, enters in an over-determining way, like the law, into this simple reaction, which resembles the babbling that goes on between a mother and a child. Because just remember, this conversation is taking place in something which are not quite vocables. When I signal to Glove-Slave to start speaking to him, the message I send is, "Hi, how are you?" You understand? You're typing fast. Okay, the rationale is that you're typing fast and you have to work quickly to be able to communicate within the very short time space in which your desire is now operating, which is that you wish to possess this object. Your typing is reduced to the minimum. Now that looks at the first sight like a reasonable thing to do, but it's not a reasonable thing to do, precisely in the sense that the relationship which it produces with the screen is that of an infantile babble. But precisely out of that infantile babble, the screen and yourself, you'll begin to generate a set of relationships within which another set of unforeseen laws operate, either to forbid or to enable the continuation of the projection of the desire which is there before you even start to formulate your messages, and which constantly is trying to concentrate itself as something which Mark would call the wish rather than the desire. That there is, if you like, an anterior desire and a specific wish, which in the space between the screen and the eye are constituted through a set of laws in which the simple babble is not innocent. And this is where, as I say, a set of overdetermining, if you like, laws come into play, in that what strikes me, even as I am signaling to Glove-Slave and saying, "How are you?" is that Glove-Slave has written something on the screen which I must recognize as more complex a space than that into which I myself can enter without a certain loss of self. Because what he has said quite precisely is that he is an admirer of black leather gloves and the men who wear them. That is, that in the statement which he gives, the priority is to the black leather glove, and the men who wear them, in a fully Althusserien sense of the Träger, I think, are nothing more or less than the bearer of the leather glove. That is, that in concretizing my own desire as a wish in relation to the figure of Glove-Slave, I must fully and completely renounce myself as someone who is visible within the field of his desire. The relationship between myself and the object, if you say, is one in which the object is, rather than fully present on the screen, fading now into becoming the objet petit a, while I myself am néantisé in front of this object if I accept my place within the metonymic slippage, which anyway is not my choice. It's not possible to say that I will or won't accept place within a metonymic slippage. But the metonymic slippage, if you like, becomes precisely the space within which my subject at the moment of writing itself on the screen will be the space in which it once again disappears. Sorry, I shouldn't be using a computer. This is really complicated. It just turned itself off. Okay, I've got it back. I think at this point I'll just show you. No, I'm not. You're not going to see Glove-Slave. Let's face it. There's no time for that. You don't get it. At the end. This again then, if you like, pulls me to a slightly later page of the same seminar of Lacan, where when he's further developed this concept of the way in which the unconscious arises precisely within this quadripartite space, the maternal object, the child, and two vocables, into which, through that combination, the law of the father inserts itself, and out of which the whole structure of the unconscious arises, that Lacan, in fact, uses the phrase a couple of pages later of a virtual reality to speak about what has come into being in the meanwhile. Now, I want to say here that had I shown you a photograph of Glove Slave, and maybe we will look at it if there's time at the end, precisely what would have happened would be that an accurate representation of place or of thing would have fallen into place, and you would have recognized a problem related to but not identical with that of finding oneself in the time and space of the metonymic slippage between the gloved hand and the man who wears it. What one would have recognized was a point where narrative not continues but comes to a sudden end. That is, the point at which the thing is represented as if the petit objet could hove above the horizon and present itself to your eyes. This, I think, would constitute itself as a moment of the death of narrative. And precisely, I think, what begins to happen in these chat rooms is that narrative dies, and that what constitutes the form of a compulsive addiction to them is not the endless spinning out of narrative, but a series of instant little deaths of narrative, which leave the subject in a state of suspension for the next stage of the production of the self, or the imaginary reproduction or projection of the self, which requires them then to carry on and to seek elsewhere. So very typically in a chat room, you generate something which is quite different, if you want to think in terms of gay sexuality, from cruising on the street. If you cruise on the street, down Oxford Street or wherever it is on a Saturday afternoon, and your eye meets someone else, you empty the street of all the other people, focus on that one person, perhaps speak to them, and perhaps leave the street with that one person. On a chat room, characteristically, you generate the opposite effect. You start one conversation, and then another, and then another, and then another, until your screen may be full of 10 or 12 even conversations, each one of which you're trying to sustain under the illusion, and this is the end of the illusion, the end of which I'm thinking about today, under the illusion that you can finally, at some point within this system of narratives, give a precise figure to your desire as if it were a wish which could be fully represented. This also, I think, introduces a number of other laws which we might call the law of the father, or which we might call the symbolic, or which we might, in sociological terms, begin to call something which is real and something which is outside this space, and which overdetermines the forms of freedom which are imaginarily generated within it. For example, if you have 5 or 6 conversations going, a figure for the city will arise out of these conversations. If you're chatting in chat room London East, for example, or London South, or you're juggling London South, London East, and London North on the basis that someone like yourself may live on the borderline of all those 3 areas, very characteristic, you will generate out of your conversations a figure for the city which contains a series of possibilities and interdictions. One of those possibilities will be the person you're chatting to is indeed physically close to you, so that a postcode, a series of postcodes, will start to enter into the discussion. That is, you will shift rapidly from the glove and the sexual taste, the sexual preference, as it's called, to postcodes. And you will start building up an image of the city in which propinquity, which anyway is absolute on the screen, is mapped in terms of fulfillability through the immediate, the nearness of the person, through whether they, like you, are in zone 1, or whether to meet them you'd have to buy a 7-day return on the underground, or whether one or the other of you has a BMW in which you can speed across the city, the time of day, the economic level at which you live, whether you can afford to get a taxi, and indeed the level of technology of your computer itself. Because at the point where you do generate as many as 10 or 12 conversations, your computer may crash and leave you stranded and forced to reload. So there are, if you like, entering here a series of banal operations into which a figure for the city, a spatial realization of the city, as if it were real, enters as a series of laws which produce your own desire as something to be concretized as a wish, as at each stage of the procedure less possible than it had been before. fall. And here again, I want to say, lies, if you like, the beginnings of something we might call an obsession or neurosis, or a pathology of some kind. But I'd like to pick up a point that came up in the discussions yesterday to perhaps dramatize precisely what I mean by this relationship between the finitude of narrative and the ways in which this particular situation I'm talking about now seem to me to pose precisely the problems of the threats to the unconscious that Christopher is talking about in building, as I think she does, on Debord and Adorno in her critique of consumer society. I was thinking while Tony was talking yesterday, and I mentioned this to one or two people, about a film of the 1950s which involves animals, which involves crocodiles, which of course are profoundly important for Freud in his own spatialization of the unconscious and civilization and its discontents. Freud talks about the coexistence of the saurian world with the modern animal world as perhaps being a form of representation of the unconscious, or one way in which we can think about the relation of the unconscious to the material world. One way of finding a figure for the unconscious. The film in question is one called The Land of the Pharaohs. And there's a scene in it where a good person is about to be sacrificed to the evil power of the pharaohs, as I remember, and is about to be hurled into a pit of crocodiles. The shot consists of a series of shots, one of which is a shot from the top of the wall from which the man is to be thrown to the crocodiles, and you see the crocodiles seething in their pit, splashing in the water. And the next shot is a shot up the wall to the man standing at the top, from which he will be pushed. The third shot is not, and this is, if you like, deprivation becomes crucial to the structure of narrative, is not seeing the man fall into the crocodiles, but seeing him fall from the wall without a fourth shot in which you see him being torn to pieces. That you do not see. The moment, if you like, of frustration or deprivation is extremely powerful, because precisely what you've expected to see is the man falling amongst the crocodiles and being torn limb from limb. Precisely that which you can see on the computer if you go into torture.com, if you go into submissionfighting.com or any other sites. Precisely what I can see if Gloveslave or Fisty Southwest One sends me his photographs, that I will see the object. But at that point, the narrative will end. At that point, the figuration, the desire will become impossible through being figured, precisely because the wish has been fulfilled and the desire has not yet been figured. One enters into, I think, a very complex slippage in the relationship between these terms and between the drives and their representability. It seems to me that in that sense, that older culture might be thought of as being profoundly sophisticated, that precisely what the maker of The Land of the Pharaohs realizes is that we will be able to continue watching the film if we do not see the crocodiles, because our deprivation of the crocodiles will prepare us for narrativity itself. That is something, for example, which a film, a very current film like Gladiator does not. You know, it's precisely that, available of an instantified, non-néantisé image which puts an end to something which we might call narrative. This then, I think, raises a number of questions with the chat rooms which put me, in a sense, either on the side of a Luddite position or on the side of a position of saying that there may be something within this process which indicates at the heart of a consumer society the possibility of some kind of undoing. I think it has to be an open question, and I think that it's not even a question that one wants to answer. It's a question that, for me, raises a number of other questions and the possibility of a number of other questions about the ways in which the spaces of modernity permit us to think the question of the unconscious in the contemporary world. And that's where, in a sense, it's useful to come back to Browning's Duchess. A heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked, and her looks went everywhere. Imagine now that I am she, and that the screen before me is either the world of the spectacle that forces my eyes to flicker so, lustfully in my tracking of it. Perhaps it is the screen, as Lacan talks about. The room behind is dark, it has absorbed the gaze. Or that the screen is not the screen, but the screen having swallowed up the object. Or that the screen, the computer screen, is the site on which the law of the father is executed. It is any or all of these things. What I think that arises as valuable in my tracking of these impossible narratives and their premature conclusion by the making of the wish as present in the vision is that they enable us to think about, I think perhaps, I'm not certain about this, in fact I have to be very modest, I'm in a complete state of anxiety about this at the moment. They enable us to think about the way in which the gaze dispenses of the subject in terms of a range of banal cultures which we've not previously had at our disposition. And that in thinking about the ways in which the subject is dispensed with, we can think also about the ways in which it might be reconstituted or in some sense saved within the structure of modern consumer cultures. Thus, this relation between the spectacular inventory of the gaze and the inventorized subject, whose flickering eyes register the fluidity of desire, the number of wishes, the motion of desiring, is one of complex displacements between the superimposed, mutually eliding frames of the spectacle and the inside that it constructs as if without its own inside. Without an unconscious, that is to say, outside unconsciousness, somewhere between the wish and the I wish to, wish for this, and the wish as an optative, as an if only. So I think that's the final distinction I would like to make in close, is that it enables us to pose this distinction between the wish in the sense of an active wish and the wish in a sense of an optative. Thank you. If you want to carry on, just carry on. I'm happy, yes.
Adrian, I just have one question.
Yes.
Can we see glove slip?
Pardon?
Can we see glove slip?
Yes, you can actually. Let me just get rid of this. Oh God, no, you'll have to wait a second. Does anyone else ask me anything else when I just juggle my thing? Yeah. Sorry, this is going to take a second to do because I can't actually do this on here now. Oh, I can actually. Where's my... I'm sorry, I'm very bad at this now. Let me just get rid of the paper. I'm afraid this has got suspended into a... There's glove slave. This one is glove slave. This is the man who bears them. And this is the gloves. So what I'm really talking about is that the involuntary arisal, the involuntary insurgence of the metonym in this space in such a way as perhaps without it theoretically being possible in this consumer culture to néantiser the subject. So I'm saying to a certain extent, I think, in these images, one is offered everything and the narrative comes to an end. And to a certain extent, within that process, something else can arise, which returns the possibility of the néantisation of the subject. And that might be a real, or it might be a way of thinking about modern cultures, which answers some of the kinds of questions posed by theorists like Christopher in her recent work, which enables us to turn somewhere other than to Arendt and Colette for answers to these problems, precisely to the kinds of everyday cultures within which we're suspended. So that would be the argument. So there's Glove Slave.
Could I just ask you about the postal codes?
The what, sorry?
about the postal codes.
Yes.
I mean, when you said that people identify themselves as having a postal code, I mean, presumably that has no substantial relation to where they live in London.
Well, I think we discussed this before, Mark, and I think I did a different version of this seminar for Mark, in fact, here. And one of the questions that I was asked was actually about self-representation. I think this is a very interesting question, because one of the questions which I was asked was, well, don't people lie all the time? And, okay, one does a certain amount of empirical work in this kind of thing too, and you do meet people from time to time. That's called research. And my conclusion is that the thing people lie most about is their waist size. That otherwise there's a remarkable compulsion to truth. And I think on that particular occasion, you yourself remarked, and I think this is very illuminating, that under a circumstance where every possibility of lying is open to you. In fact, I have a regular correspondent on these chat rooms who's in a state of deep anxiety because he has a screen name where he says he's 6 foot blonde and hunky, and he isn't. He's actually short and skinny. And he enters into conversation with this name, and this induces complete and irremediable anxiety of a kind which, in fact, he can't cope with. So that, in fact, the compulsion to be truthful and say, yes, I'm, squat and hideous and absolutely unapproachable is extremely strong. And in that sense, there's also another, I think, complex threat, if you like, posed to the structure of the unconscious, which is that of precisely muddling up the terms of what constitutes narcissism and its relationship to the other. And again, I think one has to, I was very interested in actually, can we carry on from here? I was interested in looking at Neil's slide of the Caravaggio this morning, because I thought that precisely what the Narcissus is not doing there is looking at himself. He's looking at the other half of himself, which is lit differently from the half we can see. He's looking at the half of himself which we can't see. If you look at his reflection in the water, the light-shade relationship is reversed, which means he's seeing that we're seeing the whole of him, but he's not seeing himself. So if you like, that representation of Narcissus becomes a very complex one when you bring the relation of the viewer of Narcissus viewing into the image. And what I want to say is that, in fact, some of these phenomena pass through this relationship of constant self-representation to others in this kind of arena. And that, if you like, coupled with this compulsion to honesty, which I think is fairly widespread, is something which raises a theoretical question which I can't answer over what it is that narcissism is in everyday processes of self-representation. And this is a different kind of narcissism from the narcissistic identification, say, in the Mulvian model of narrative cinema. That's where I think it becomes important. That's where I begin to think these cultures take us out of that kind of model of narrativity, precisely beyond them, and leave us in a different kind of field which probably hasn't yet been properly described, but might be present in many of the things which people have been talking about today. So that space between the view oneself and the screen viewing is a very specific configuration of something which we might call a space of the symptomatology of the unconscious.